Asian Americans a special place in the organizing world for people from New York. You get things done. You have a special energy. You don't take shit. You know, and I got to tell you, I know this because I pretty much am an East Coast person, and 20 years ago moved to California to be with my now wife. And when I was an executive editor, was the executive editor at Ms. Magazine. I wrote about this in Asian American Dreams, but I was kind of walking to work, half days with a cup of coffee. And I had to buy a present for like a wedding or something like that was coming up. So I was in Times Square, and I went into one of those Times Square shops, which was stupid to begin with. But I went into one of those shops, and the guy tells me it's, this thing was going to cost $200. And I knew that was like the list price. So I said to the guy, so what's the real price, And he looked at me, and this guy was an immigrant too from, Europe, and he says, "You people from Taiwan, you people from Hong Kong, you people, you always want to, whatever." And at that moment, I had my cup of coffee, and I took it and I threw it. And from there on, there was no dialogue, but anyway, so now when I tell people, like on the West Coast, where it's much more mellow that this ever happened, or they read this in my book, they're like, "Wow, you're like an angry person." And I'm like, no, that is normal in New York. And not only that, if you don't do something like that, then people just assume they can step all over you. Now, when I told this, to a friend of mine here in New York, a young organizer, she said, "Yeah, I was on, also in Times Square." She was standing, getting ready to cross the street. She said, "I know exactly what you mean. I was just standing there getting ready to cross the street, and some guy looked at me and spit at me." And she was standing with him at the light, and she was smoking a cigarette, which I have to say I don't condone. But anyway, she took the cigarette and she put the butt out on his arm. But so that's the energy and the kind of thing about pushing the envelope. Now, you don't all have to do stuff like this, but the thing about it is the energy you have here in New York is something that people really don't get in other parts of the country. And we always, the thing about organizing is being able to push the envelope so that other people can, that you open up a space for other people. And that happens here in New York. Being in California, I have to say I had to kind of tone myself down because my wife finds it socially unacceptable for me to be in other spaces. But, when the time comes and I need to do it, I do. And this is what you learn here in New York. So you are really a special bunch of activists and organizers, and don't forget that. You are opening the doors and paving the way for other people everywhere. So let me just say this is a really critical time for you to be having these kind of conversations here at NYCAASC because clearly it's a time of great change. Whether we're looking at economic instability around the world or political polarization throughout the globe that largely is a result of American fundamentalism, American invasion, American caused wars, which have all resulted and contributed to the scapegoating and silencing of all peoples who are on the margins here in America. And it's a time of great contradiction and transition, which really means it's imperative that we keep our community's voices and concerns visible and present, because all these tectonic plates are shifting. It's, at this time, and a lot is up for grabs. And so the thing about today is we don't know what history is going to record about 2013, when history is finally written about this really extraordinary time in history. But make no mistake, this is your time. This is your time to look at what's happening and to do something about it. So your theme about en route is really, to me, I thought especially apt because our communities really are in a state of dynamic change. En route, a journey. And so we are on a journey, if you will. And indeed, every one of you, every one of us is part of that journey together. And when I was sitting in your seats not so long ago, it was really a whole different scene, a whole different vibe. In those days, when I was a student, there were, maybe 1 million Asian Americans, maybe not even 1 million, in the entire U.S., and That includes places where, that have names like Chinatowns, Manila towns, little Tokyos in the state of Hawaii and parts of California. And so places like even New York City outside of Chinatown, the whole state of New Jersey, and elsewhere we were totally invisible. You could go places and people would say like, wow, what planet did you land from? Where are you people from? And even though they still say stuff like that, then it was like, the answer was Mars, as far as everybody else was concerned. And the thing that people don't understand is we were so invisible because of ethnic cleansing. The ethnic cleansing of the 1800s really did a number, and it was really successful. And that's why the numbers of Asian Americans were so low compared to other populations and communities. But so, growing up as a second generation daughter of Chinese immigrants, I never knew that there were Asian Americans who were kind of wandering around on these very streets in New York and throughout the Northeast and throughout America in the 1800s. I mean, who knew? And that stuff was completely invisible to me, and I know it was invisible to me, and most other Americans had no idea that there were that Asians could be Americans too, and in fact there were many. And if you look at that silence and you look at that invisibility, then you could really understand why there are so many totally ignorant stereotypes, about Asian Americans. I mean, you can still run into people who have no idea, who have never met or spoken to somebody of Asian descent. And so what is going to fill their minds? What they see on TV or in the movies. And of course, we know how junk that is. So the thing about it is now is your time. And now it's a totally different time. There are more than 18 million Asian Americans in the US, and right here in New York City, there's more than 1 million. So that's like one out of every 8 people is an Asian American. It's a totally different scene. And yet, when I say it's a time of transition, but also contradiction, some things haven't changed a lot. How many of you watched or participated in the last presidential elections? Okay, come on, I know a lot of you did, right? Okay. And how many of you, observed them and watched and cared? That's probably everybody in this room, right? And if you watch the convention, if you watch I watched both the Republican and Democratic national conventions, it was kind of amazing to see that there were some, very few Asian faces. There was Cal Penn, there was Tammy Duckworth, and Nikki Haley, and Bobby Jindal, and that was about it. And they might have mentioned that they were Asian, but there was nothing about our narrative, our story, about, well, what are you doing there? It just sort of was a coincidence that they happened to have somewhat Asian faces. And whereas you could look at Marco Rubio or the San Antonio mayor, Julian Castro, and they told incredible stories of their journey, their family's journeys to becoming American. Now, we have had that before. What I'm trying to say is, in my view, and a lot of the other kind of longtime Asian American activists, it was a step backward into being kind of invisible again. And so when we look at how the Latino community has really kind of come out and progressed when 10 years ago they also were quite invisible, we need to do that too. We need to change that. And it's not just that as an example. We can look at the 20th anniversary of the 1992 LA uprisings, also known as the LA riots, where the Korean American community in particular was very hard hit by that, and there was a lot of tension. And 20 years after that, you listen to the news reports of the commemoration. It's like, wow, Asians were not part of that at all. There was nothing, and its history is recorded. History belongs to those who tell the stories, who tell the history, who write the history, who do the films and documentaries, and who do the blogs. And we will be cut out unless we take ownership of that. So some of this is just a good reminder to say history and social change and social progress really doesn't move in a straight line. at least not most of the time. There are zigzags, you go this way and that way, and sometimes you go backwards. But the thing is, you can never let up, because you have to keep pushing it forward. And that's one of the big lessons that I've learned in my years as an activist, which is that we have to do it ourselves. Nobody is going to make change for us. Only we are the ones who will be making change. And you can. That's the thing, because this is your time. And we are in an age of the internet and social media. And it's great to see how much social media and networking and things like that are going on here. Because this is a time of incredible ability at a very low cost, having a cell phone to be able to create your own media, to tell your own stories, and that is your universe. That is where the change of the future is happening. And so, so we can make these changes. Now, when I look back at, the Tsin case in the 1980s, we were up against total ignorance. I mean, like I said, people thought we were from Mars. They had no idea who we were. So every time we ever spoke, it was like having to do a quick Asian Americans 101 class every time. Yes, we've been in America. Yes, some of us did the railroads. Yes, some of us are new immigrants. But we had to go through that every time. And in those days, there was no internet. There were no computers even. Can you imagine? And no cell phones. The PCs were just beginning. So we had to use the technology that we had at hand, which was mostly telephones, photocopiers, and just go out there and hit the streets. And what I learned from that, no matter what medium you have, is that we have to, they say content is king. Well, what is content? It's our stories. It's what we care about. It's the change we want to make. It's the change we want to be in this world. And that's what we have to put out there and fill in those empty spaces that are just currently occupied by stereotypes and stuff like that. And so you can tell the real stories of your communities, your campuses, your families, the things that say that Asian Americans don't belong in this world, And so you can do it because you have the tools and you have the spirit and the energy to do it. Another thing I learned is that we have to raise our voices wherever we are like I said, you here in New York, you have that, you can push the envelope for the rest of the country, really for the rest of the world in a lot of ways. It's not easy to do when we've been silenced, when we've been so invisible. The default to people is we're going to just sit there and take whatever. I mean, people say, oh, Asian Americans, they're just like, they're just like white people. They'll just take whatever. They won't say speak up. And, right? So, and it's a constant struggle for ourselves. For me, it was. I mean, even as a young activist in college, as part of the civil rights movement, part of the anti-war movement, part of the women's liberation movement, it was not always easy to raise my voice. And I'll give you an example of that. After I had graduated from college, a few years out of college, so a little older than some of you are here, I had my lesbian trial. And so what do I mean by that? I was in Boston then. I was organizing in a community that was both Chinese, Puerto Rican, and African American mainly. And we were doing a lot of community organizing, and I was also part of a really huge women's movement in the Boston area. And so one day, my fellow activists in my, we called them third world community, said, let's have a meeting. That's what people do when you're activists, you have a lot of meetings. And so they said, we're going to have a meeting, come here, be here at this time. And I'm like, okay, I didn't even ask what's the meeting about. But as soon as I got there, it was pretty clear what it was about, because they said, okay, Helen, you sit here. And everybody else was sitting in a semicircle around me. So it's like, okay, I'm like in the middle, what's this about? And so my black and Asian fellow activists in the room said, the leader of the two different collectives got up and said, Helen, we've noticed that you're hanging around with a lot of lesbians. And so, the Tariq, who was the leader of the African American collective, said, in our black community, we do not accept homosexuality. It is a symptom of petty bourgeois self-indulgence. It is a white thing. And if you are a lesbian, we wouldn't want to have anything to do with you or the other Asians either. You know, why would me have anything to do with the other Asians? But that was what he said. Then the leader, Floyd, of the Asian American Collective said, that's right, this is unacceptable in our Asian community. We do not have homosexuals in our community. So, Helen, tell us, are you a lesbian? Now, here I was, today we would call it questioning. You know, I didn't have a girlfriend, I didn't get a membership card, I didn't have anything like that, you know, and in fact, all these other women I knew, they were not all lesbians, they were feminists, you know, and, but there's an assumption and a stigma attached to feminists that like, oh, you're all lesbians. But anyway, some of them were lesbians, and some of them were my friends. And here I was questioning, and they're saying, so Helen, are you a lesbian? Because if you are, we will, in essence, excommunicate you from the community of color that I belong to. And so I thought about it, and in my head, I'm like, am I a lesbian? I don't know, you know, at this point in my life. But I know if I say yes, I'm no longer in this community either. So I said, no, I'm not a lesbian. And what? Why was that? You know, so I stepped into the closet door and slammed it shut. And you know what it was? I didn't have the self-awareness then. I didn't have the self-confidence. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to reply. And so what if I am? So what? Well, so anyway, that was when I did not have the ability to speak up. And this was already being an activist in college and in my communities. So what I'm saying is it's not always easy, but the thing is to be able to recognize that we have to push ourselves sometimes to speak up. So fast forwarding from there a little bit, I ended up, after my lesbian trial, in the city of Detroit, the Motor City. I went there to do labor organizing. Some of my friends said, you know, if you really want to know about organizing in America, you should go to the heartland of America. And in fact, I knew some people in Detroit, and in those days you could get a job. And so I went to Detroit. I actually went to work for Chrysler Corporation. I was in a Chrysler stamping plant and cranking out the hoods and the doors and things like that that go into, you know, one of the 10,000 parts that go into making your cars. And so anyway, how many of you are familiar with or have seen Who Killed Vincent Chin, or you're aware of the Vincent Chin case, the hate crime against, so many of you are. And for those of you who aren't, that was a time when I was in Detroit when there was so much anti-Japanese and anti-Asian hatred because the auto industry had collapsed. And rather than blame anything about American manufacturing systems or the economics, they blamed Japan. Because Japan, damn it, they made those fuel-efficient cars and people weren't buying American cars anymore. So anyway, but what that resulted in was the killing of a Chinese-American man in a city where there were so few Asian Americans. And at a bar at his bachelor party, 2 white auto workers saw him at this, pretty sleazy strip type bar and said, "It's because of you motherfuckers that we're out of work." And then they proceeded to chase him through the streets of Detroit and beat him to death with a baseball bat. I was there when, not at the bar, but I was there in Detroit when that happened. And everybody who read the news about this really tragic incident where the bridegroom, 1 week before his wedding, was beaten to death. And so his 400 wedding guests, instead of going to his wedding, went to his funeral. Anybody who was Asian who read that sad story knew that there was something about this. There was something more about it because Asians never made it into the news at all. And so here's some guy, who I didn't know, but I just knew there was something more about it. And then sure enough, it made its way through criminal court, and the next time it's in the news is when his killers, who were witnessed, there was no question, 70 people, at a crowded McDonald's and on the streets of this major thoroughfare in Detroit, kind of like Broadway here, witnessed the whole thing. So there's no question they beat him to death with a baseball bat. But the judge said, these aren't the kind of men you send to jail. These are white men in suits. They won't do this again, and gave them probation. So out of that, I mean, that's a whole racially charged message, right, in a city like Detroit. So what kind of people do you send to jail if you don't send these guys to jail? And there was an explosion. Within the Asian community, people got together and we said, what can we do about this? It's open season, basically declaring open season on anybody who looks Japanese, like Vincent Chin, a Chinese American did. And somebody can take a baseball bat or a gun or a knife and shoot us or kill us, and what? Nothing, right? So that was where everybody was at. It was like, every one of us is at risk now. So we started to have meetings. I went to a meeting. I was a young reporter then. I had just gotten my first journalism job, from being a freelancer for quite a while. I got a job. And because I was a reporter, I looked up the reporters who wrote about the news part, and I called them up and I said, who are these Asian men, the Chinese leaders that you interviewed? I got some phone numbers. I called them up and said, what's the community doing? And they said, well, we don't know, but why don't you come to a meeting? Okay, there were 4 of us at that meeting. Then we organized and had another meeting where we said, let's have a community meeting. There were about 15 or 20 people at that meeting, including Mrs. Chin, the mother of Vincent Chin. And so if you can imagine, we were in a small back room in a Chinese restaurant, the one where Vincent used to work as a waiter, and people who never met each other. I didn't know any of these people before, and we met and we're talking about what can we do about this. And one by one people were saying, once a judge has sentenced somebody, it's almost impossible to change, which is true, still true today. It's almost impossible to change. There's really nothing you can do. So within this room, there was kind of silence. People were like, oh, there's nothing we can do. And you could feel the energy sapping out of the room. And the only sound in the room was Vincent's mother, who was sobbing in grief. And she understood English quite well. She understood people were saying there's nothing that can be done about the killing of her son and the terrible injustice. And so I sat there, I went there, I was a young reporter, I was a young activist, and I thought, what do you mean there's nothing we can do? Are we going to walk out of this room and do nothing? And tell the world that Asian Americans, once again, are just going to be silent bystanders when we ourselves are getting killed? And so I thought, but I just got my journalism job. Aren't we as journalists just supposed to observe and not speak up, not be part of the story? And so for about a half second, I sat there and I thought, no, we can't let nothing happen. So I raised my hand. And I said, we can't let people think we don't care. We have to say something. And in that simple thing of raising my hand and just saying what was in my heart, you could feel the energy in the room shifted. And then people started talking about what can we do instead of what can't we do. Now, I'm not telling you this to say, well, look what I did. I'm telling you this because every one of us faces choices all the time, right? I mean, how many of you have been in a room where something happened or something was said and you thought, that's not cool? But should I say something? Should I, it might not have been about Asians, it might have been about, any other group or situation. And I mean, that happens to us all the time. Throughout life, that will happen all the time. And what I'm telling you is that's a choice. And in that moment, I raised my hand. But that could be at any point in your life, where you have a choice to speak up, whether you raise your hand or whether you just say, hey, that's not cool with me. And it's just that act of raising your voice. I know sometimes it's like, well, I don't know the perfect way I'm going to formulate this. You don't have to have it all together. Even the act of speaking up and saying, that's not cool. I mean, then you have a moment to think about, okay, if they ask me why not, that you can say why not. But the thing about it is just even expressing yourself when everybody assumes that an Asian American will say nothing. And, everything is cool with us. And even if it isn't, we'll just let it happen. So that's one of the lessons I learned. Even if you don't know exactly what it is you're going to say, if you want to make a point, at least raise your hand and say it. So when you do, there's also the thing about, what do you say? And the thing is to be able to connect the dots. you know, and this is something you're doing right here. I mean, that's what En route is about, right? It's about being able to explain why it's not cool to you or why it is cool to you, you know, and to be able to show the linkage between you and this community and other communities, and to being able to build, like we did in the Vincent Chin case, a multiracial, you know, cross-class, cross-religion organizing effort. And you have to do this because, you know, the landscape really is changing globally. I mean, you know, we know there's a lot of instability. You are coming into the world, becoming adults in a time of instability, and there is, though, this pivot to Asia, which President Obama is leading. He's one of the few leaders of America who even knows that Asia exists, right? Even though Hawaii is not part of America, but to the birther movement anyway. But it really is the century of Asia and the Pacific, and so he is totally on target, you know, to say, look, we can't ignore the rest of the globe here. But we also do need to know that the political attention in times of domestic crisis often is thrown over to other, you know, sort of international or foreign conflicts to kind of deflect attention. And so where isn't there tension in Asia and the Pacific? You know, you've got China, India, Pakistan, Korea, West Asia, you name it. And so any of these areas can be a hotspot with grave implications for you, for our communities here. And so my point in trying to cruise through all of this really fast is to say that this is your opportunity today, you know, to use the tools that you have that are far and away, like, so much more advanced than we had. And you at your fingertips have the capability of reaching every corner of the globe with your cell phones and your computers. And don't forget, good old-fashioned street organizing too. There's nothing like one-on-one organizing. So the answer today, you know, one of the really important things today is to create our own media, to create our own stories, our own narrative, to not be dependent on big media. I mean, in fact, they rely on YouTube and internet hit rates to see what goes on the screen. I mean, look at the phenomenon with Psy and Gangnam Style, I mean, you know, right? And so we have to take our lessons from that, take our lessons from Angry Asian Man, Phil Yu, and I know he's been here, and other websites, like one of my favorites is newamericamedia.org, or even Low Tech, I'm in Low Tech now, which is writing books, but it's all about writing our own stories, telling our own stories the way we know it to be true, and if we don't do it, nobody else will. So sometimes students ask me if it takes a big issue, like the Vincent Chin case, to move people, to create a movement. And I you know, it puzzles me because I have to say, no. I mean, every issue has the potential to be a big issue. We don't know. When we started out with the Vincent Chin case, people just said, well, this is just another killing. What's the big deal? Why do you care? You know, and it's all about you being able to show people why it is a big issue. And today, you know, there is no lack of big issues out there. I mean, immigration, right, one of the top issues. I just attended a great workshop this morning about immigration, and one of the comments was just how invisible, you know, that invisibility again, that Asian Americans are in that debate, even though out of every community, every racial community here in America, Asian Americans are more impacted. We have more proportion of immigrants in our community than any other, and we're totally left out of that debate. So you know, that is a huge issue. What about hate crimes? I mean, right here in New York, now I have to say I was watching this from California, but the two people who were killed by being pushed in front of subway trains, so coincidentally, were both Asian. Now I have to ask, you know, how much was looked into that of being hate crimes? And we don't have to know whether they are or not. We just have to say, we demand that this be looked at as them because, and then to go in and connect the dots for people. You know, what other issues? I mean, suicides among Asian American students, and you know, that's like an epidemic, and that is totally invisible. I could run down the laundry list of Iraq, Afghanistan, Danny Chen, Harry Liu, James Yi, and the fragging and stuff like that goes on of Asian American soldiers. I actually gave testimony. I was asked to be a witness in the marriage trial that's going to be ruled on in June by the Supreme Court. And many of the named plaintiffs around the country at statewide court cases, lawsuits for marriage equality, whether it's in Oregon, California, Vermont, and around the country, many of them have Asian American same-sex couples, lesbian and gay couples, that were the named plaintiffs. And in this Supreme Court case, I was a witness, and the only witness who was willing to appear against same-sex marriage was a Chinese American reverend. And the things he said were pretty incredible, but he had 2 different Chinese language websites. And among the things he said about them for the anti-gay side was, of course, things that we've heard in every community, which is if 2 women or 2 men are allowed to get married, that's going to lead to polygamy, more polygamy, bestiality, child molestation, and an end to the human race. So my marriage to Leah is going to lead to the end of the human race. And you have to think, okay, why? That seems weird. Well, the reasoning is this: because heterosexuals are going to stop having sex if I marry Leah. I mean, how else will the human race end, right? So anyway, my point about this is that throughout the whole marriage equality debate, there have been so many Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and right now in the state of Hawaii, there are some Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans who are leading a new civil rights case. And so any of these topics that are broad topics that affect all of America, and people say, well, what does that have to do with Asian Americans? Well, we are everywhere. It's just about us. It's about the activists. It's about the organizers being able to get our stories out, to connect the dots, and to show it in ways that people will get it. The persistent and awful model minority myth, the model minority stereotype, that too still has to be, we have to take that, silver spike and drive it into that thing, because, even at a lot of schools right here, represented right here, people will look at the students, and say, well, look, you're all so successful, you're all, just like white people. And so, you're the model minority. And we have to tell our stories. That's just another example, because if we don't, it's not only other people telling us, it's other Asian Americans who believe it. And I know every one of you know people who say, but aren't we the model minority? Look how well we're doing. What's wrong with being the, quote, good minority? And so we have to address that. We have to talk about it. And to say, yes, there are privileged Asian Americans, just like in every other community, but there are also ones who are poor, and ones who are disadvantaged, and who are not rich, like people think that every Asian American is so. And I am getting the hook. So what I just want to close with is to say, you are the ones who have the talent and tools to take on these issues and to change the narratives. And so please know this. You are the ones who are going to take the Asian American community to new levels. You are the ones who can define for ourselves and for the rest of the world what it means to be Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in this country. And as students, you should really take every opportunity you can to experiment with activism, to take on leadership, to push the envelope, to make other people uncomfortable, and express what it is that you believe in. So don't ever be afraid to challenge authority, even if it means taking on community institutions that were created by my generation. So, as you go on through this conference and throughout your college years, just remember that you are the ones, and this is your time. And you will be shaping the world of tomorrow by the voice and the conscience that you raised today. And one final tip. As I once said to another college group, Asian Americans have to stop being so fucking polite. I just want you to know that I don't mean that you should go out and be indiscriminately rude to people, okay? Be discriminately rude. And what I mean is we have to raise our voices and be outrageous when necessary. And you here in New York, that is your special role. And that is simply so we can be heard. That's simply so that we can be taken seriously. It is simply so that you can be real participants in this democracy. So learn your lessons well on your campuses and here at NYCAASC today. Claim your rightful voices everywhere and don't be afraid to raise them. Let people know that you have the right to speak up, that you intend to speak up, and that you are not going to be fucking polite. So my thanks to all of you and your kind attention and for the special dynamism you bring to your campuses and communities. Remember, this is your time. Don't let it go to waste. Thank you for your kind attention.